Recording now. Today's event is the first of 4 subsequent events that we have implemented on feedback from the ad hoc student survey. As you all know, in the middle of the autumn semester, you and the students had to switch back to online teaching yet again. And in response to concerns about students' mental health, and an ad hoc survey was conducted in December of last year, and the students feel that they have in general good support, but the pandemic is still taking a heavily toll on their well-being. And among other things, the survey revealed how important and supportive a good learning atmosphere and cohesion within the class are. And that's why we decided to bring this topic and the discussions up here. And although we did not ask for it in the survey, some students voluntarily shared examples of instructors with whom they had particularly positive learning experiences in distance learning, or who created a good atmosphere in class. And most of these were not mentioned by name, but some were. And 5 of them will share their ways of building a relationship with their students now. So a warm welcome to our presenters, and thank you for your willingness to share your experiences with us. Then I want to hand over to my colleague Karin Braun, who will moderate this event today. Karin.
Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and see some familiar and some new faces again. So my role is just to help keep the event rolling forward so that we get to the end on time, and to introduce our speakers one at a time. I ask that you can always put your questions in the chat if you have a question, but in general, we will hold the questions to the end so that we can have a collaborative conversation. Because the event is being recorded, I'm happy to voice any questions that people may not want to voice themselves. In order to get started, I want to just introduce all 5 presenters, and they're in the order in which they will present, and then we will start with the first presenter. So we have got Professor Alessandro Carlotto, Professor Susanne Ulbrich, Professor Ralf Spolenak, Professor Tom Emerson, and Professor Milica Topalovic. Thank you so much for being here. We know it's a busy time. We appreciate the fact that you're willing to share your insights into this topic, connecting with students, whether that be face-to-face, online, offline, in other ways. You have been mentioned by name by your students, and so we would love to hear why you think that is. I would like to start with Professor Alessandro Carlotto. Please, the floor is yours.
So thank you for can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks for having me here. It's of course a pleasure for me to share my experience and also to learn from so many inspiring colleagues. So let me now share my screen. I've prepared a very short presentation to give some structure to what I'm gonna say. So I hope you can see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let me start by the way we mathematicians often do, by sort of formulating the problem, or rather reformulating it in a way which is, say, more tractable or more precise. So the problem we start from is somehow to connect 2 planes. Any learning experience has 2 fundamental components, right? The instructor on one side, the students on the other. And sort of historically or traditionally, there's an apparent distance between these 2 planes, right? There's a physical distance in a way that is going to be shown in a photo in a second. So you're going to see what I mean by physical distance in just a second. There may often be an age gap, and for sure there may be a cultural gap, in the sense that somehow it's a postulate of the educational agreement that the information will mostly flow in one direction from the instructor to the students. And so in some sense, really connecting to me means to try and fill this gap while creating a relation of mutual trust between the 2 parties. And in a way, I'll try to discuss about connection at 3 different levels, each level being somehow a prerequisite for the following ones. So the most basic level is what I would call human connection. So this has to do with one of our one of the first things we all experienced at age 18 when we started our studies, namely the experience of entering a huge lecture hall with a single instructor in front of, say, 500 desks, and with a person in each desk, right? And the point is, well, as you enter that room, you don't really cease to be an individual. You still want to be, as such, recognized and treated. And so, although we may not be able to somehow demolish this system, we may nevertheless try to redefine human interactions from what I would call a 1-to-k dynamics to, or rather a one-directional 1-to-k dynamics to a rather two-directional 1-to-1 scheme. So let me try to be very concrete and tell you what I mean with these words. So what could be, you know, somehow a reasonable recipe to try and build a tailor-made teaching experience? Well, first of all, as trivial as it may sound, learn your student's name. Here is a trivial but sort of enlightening example of this phenomenon. Let's say you're in lecture 1 of analysis 1, you have 500 people in front of you, and after half an hour, somebody raises his hand or her hand to ask a question. Well, then you may approach the situation in 2 different ways. Approach A would be just say, yes, sir, or yes, lady, please ask your question. That's approach A. But there's also an approach B, which is, hi, Paul, it's nice to finally get to know you in person. Why don't you share your question with us, okay? And the difference is not quite in the perception of Paul, but in the perception of the other 499 people, right? Which are gonna perceive the instructor in a totally different way, depending on whether you take approach A or approach B. Of course, you don't just wanna learn your student's name, you also want to learn something deeper about them. For instance, why they're taking the course, what they want to get out of it, what they want to do for a living, what's their dream job, and stuff like that. And that's typically some amount of information that I collect through what I call homework 0 assignment, which is somehow a homework assignment I give right at the beginning of the class to make sure I can associate to each name a certain personality. And of course, you don't just want this to happen at the beginning, but you also want the students to be protagonists of the course with you, which means you want to encourage them all the time to ask questions, add remarks, get beyond what you can cover in class. So that's level 1, human connection, which is a prerequisite for what comes next. Level 2 is what I would call emotional connection. So let me start with a real life story. So when I was working at Stanford, a senior colleague, who, by the way, was later awarded a Fields Medal, once told me the following statement, quoted, "Here students want to be entertained." Now, of course, I'm not sure that is exactly the case, especially here at ETH, and also I'm not sure I can get any close to Freddie Mercury in the quality of the performance. But for sure, associating positive feelings to a course, to an instructor or a subject makes the learning process much lighter. And so how can we try to create what I call emotional connection? So again, some basic hints could be as follows. So first of all, the most important aspect is to devote a serious amount of time in the design of your lectures. So you want to make sure whenever you enter a classroom, you are aware of your role, you're aware of the importance of what you're doing. You want to design your lecture carefully, and you want to perform as if it was an event, and in fact a special event. Namely, you want to perform as if you were on a stage. You then want, again, your students to be part of the show through their emotions and through their participation. Now, here is an example. A typical challenge I faced when I moved here to Switzerland was the following. Let's say I present a proof and then I ask, is it clear for everybody? And the typical outcome is that, you know, we have many shy people in the audience and nobody will ever provide feedback. So here's the way I try to resolve the problem. I will simply turn 180 degrees, looking at the board, and ask the people for whom the proof is not clear to just stand up, and I will ask one of them to count them, okay? So Now, what are the advantages of this scheme? Now, first of all, I get more information. I get a precise idea about what fraction of the class needs that point to be repeated. Second, I let the students express their concerns without any sort of fear. Third, for those people who are struggling on that point, I associate a key conceptual point in the lecture to a physical emotion. They are standing up, so they are making themselves aware of a hard point in the lecture, which is going to make what I'm going to say later maybe a lot more easier to remember. And then a third principle, which of course is not disjoint from the previous two, is we want our lectures to be neat, to have a good logical structure, but we also want in each of them to have some memorable moments. So this is what in the American system is called the three things game, right? So, you know, let's say you talk about wave equations, why don't you bring your guitar? You are talking about minimal surfaces, why don't you play with soap bubbles? So you want to make sure that no matter how good, how neat the logical structure of your lecture is, you want them to bring at home three things per lecture, okay? And that is, you know, somehow the basis of what I would call the emotional level of connection. And then, of course, we come to the third and, in a way, most central aspect, which is rather what I would call a scientific connection. So here is somehow the idea which I try to implement since I moved to ETH, which is to sort of switch from a model, a pedagogical model based on the concept of digestion of something coming from the instructor, to a model which emphasizes what I would rather call creation, or if you want, the process of discovery over the results themselves. Equivalently, one could say that somehow we want to look at the pyramid of knowledge that I've depicted there, and we want to go high up rather than low, right? Again, you know, how can you sort of switch from a model based on information to a model based on knowledge and wisdom? So here are some very concrete, very quick suggestions. So first of all, you want to build a model where the emphasis is on questions rather than on answers. Namely, you want to, you know, focus on you want to build an open rather than a closed model of knowledge. Also, especially in math, but certainly not only in our subject, I guess you want to abolish the popular do as you were taught scheme, which I think is reason number one why, you know, entire generations of students really hate our subject. And third, but again related to the previous one, I guess, you know, we don't, I mean, I've never seen my mandate as offering a course, but rather building a community, right? So we want to make sure to give the idea that we are all part of the same workshop and we are all working together in the learning process. So just to summarize, I think really the whole purpose of my short talk was really to rather define the problem. And in my view, there are three fundamental levels of connections: the human connection, the emotional connection, the scientific connection. Each level is somehow a prerequisite for the following one, but all of them are strictly intertwined and combined together to the scope that I indicated at the beginning, namely filling the gap between the two parties that constitute a learning model. So I guess I'm essentially over time. So for the moment, let me stop it here. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to the question time.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I've taken a few notes because I think you've raised some really interesting points. I think using the word students as protagonists is an unusual way to hear lecturers speak of their students, and one that I wish I heard more often. So thank you for offering that. And also your intention of building a community rather than simply sort of running a course, I think is again something that is a very, very valuable contribution to the discussion. Can I just check that you need to leave early today? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I'm lecturing later, but I'll try to stay at least for some part of the meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. Because we would like to move on to our next presenter now, which is Susanne Ulbrich, so we can hear from you, and then we'll collect all these ideas and sort of stir them around in a pot and have a very interesting discussion. Susanne, can I pass the floor over to you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for all those that come to participate. Actually, I feel like I'm a participant myself, because when I was invited, I heavily thought about, I was quite surprised and pleased, I have to say, to be mentioned, but I couldn't think of anything I would have done that would, made the students mention specifically myself. So I asked backward to the team, specifically to Julia, did they specifically mention which role I'm taking? So I'm a docent and I'm a study director. And relating to the role as a study director, I could foresee that, or I could think that maybe there are regular meetings that we have with the student representatives of all the different years that we have. And we have implemented that since the very beginning of the pandemic, now a year ago, so that this sort of interactions and taking seriously the students into a role where they would be distributors of information to their students and collectors of information to us as leading the study program and trying to connect to the docents as well. So I could consider a role there, but Julia said, no, it's also the lectures. And then I got confused because I don't really know what I'm specifically doing. So I'm not that theoretical as Alessandro put it there, and I'm not preparing I did not prepare any slides. What I do thought is that having two different roles, maybe a third one as well, could have contributed to the fact that some students mentioned, particularly the courses I have taught, and so I'm a lecturer, I'm a study director, I'm a mother actually of 4 children, being in different grade schools and having experienced very different sorts of being at home, being a student, not being able to join courses themselves, and then having to deal with a lot of different challenges relating from this home office scenery in the back, which you see my sort of room, a very personal part of my life. The homeschooling, needing to be on time or even be a couple of minutes late because the first lecture doesn't exist, and you have to sort of find a solution for that. And in the same way that the students might tackle their problems in that way. So part of what I think might be or might play a role in is that on the one hand side, being having a sort of intuition of how to speak to a camera, how to try to connect to everybody, and maybe also asking them before we start, could you please share your screen? Because I just want to know, what your background looks like, and whether you are in CHN or in LFW, or obviously not anywhere at ETH or in Zurich, but rather at home. So having an intuition about trying as best to connect would be one thing. Second thing would be trying to have an empathy relating to the situation. So not only starting right away with the topic of interest today, but rather here and there. And that is probably what I do some once in a while, asking, what happened, for example, Tom, to the back of your shelf, why did it a little bit skirt? Is there any, sort of disentangling there? Or is that just architecture? Or is that the issue of the camera, which makes a sort of angle there? So there you go. I find it extremely helpful to have a name tag on every student, because I would never ever memorize Tom's name if I wouldn't know him. And with more than 10 students, I'm helplessly gone, because this is not my part that I can easily do. So I do remember voices and faces totally easily over decades, but not names. So that might be helpful, and I can sort of add on to what Alessandro said there. The third thing, which I find maybe of interest or of importance, would be the emphasis on the enthusiasticness and passionate learning or experience of the topic that I have for the topic that I teach. That is not specifically something that relates to this distant learning issue, but it relates to the fact that if I consider myself in a problematic situation, I'll share that. And if I do consider myself passionate about my topic, because nevertheless the pandemic is around, my topic in some way or the other links to that. No matter what you speak about, it's not only exponential increase way, which you can sort of link to pandemic in any sort of situation. It's also about the social dimension, the mathematical dimension, the so that you always can link to the actual situation that you have from your topic, and that makes the topic also linked to the actual situation. So if I try to be enthusiastic and passionate about my topic, I just hope that the students can share that to some part, even if some of the technique breaks down, some of my internet is unstable or whatever, but I try to give the red thread and trying to continue where I was lost with the enthusiasm that I normally have in class as well. So for me, the challenges of the distance learning was specifically that I love to speak with my hands, and here they don't appear in my picture, so they don't normally appear in my view here. And I also like to walk around, which in some way might be something that I still try to do in having this online lectures, which are always not recorded. So they are recorded, but they are live. They take place. I do not read a manuscript, but rather speak openly, which might bring some clarity into everything, but also might give some of this intuitive being me as a teacher to the documents that can then be read alone. So the additional material that the pupils have. So for me, there is not really a key or a list of keys. It's part of, I think, what makes a good teacher, part of what everybody can be authentic about themselves, to find their way through this challenging time, which I still is ongoing. So with that, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and sharing different views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanne. How genuine and passionate your delivery was too. So I can see how your students would probably feel some of that in your lecture time as well. It's also something we've heard from a few people, is this idea of, well, I'm not really sure what I did, but they seem to like it. So we're pleased we could offer you an opportunity to reflect on that so that we can help make those sorts of things visible. Thank you very much for your contribution. I have notes for questions for later. So we will then move on to our next presenter, and that is Professor Ralf Spolenak. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, but if I haven't, you'll please correct me.
Thank you, Karen. That's absolutely fine. So as Susanne said, I also don't know really why I'm here, but I can share my experiences. I've been trying a lot, and some things worked and some things didn't. And as the point has already been made, the personal connection is very important. I teach classes from, let's say, 20 people to 300, and you'll see there's a huge difference also in the approach you can take. And for the ones with 20, 30, many of them I try to know from years before. And then I try to start the lecture a little bit early and talk to people like Susanne also mentioned. Specifically here, could say, hey, Michael, how did you enjoy lunch last week where we briefly met? Or Marluz, I miss sharing a lecture hall with you. Or Darina, how did your walk go when we met 3 weeks ago? Now that was also a coincidence of 3 people that I just ran into in here, and I try to do the same thing with the students. And as Susanne mentioned, pinpointing something in their backgrounds really helps. I have one student who is a professional musician, and he has a very specific microphone which he uses, and that's also a good way to get started. Or another student overtook me at a solar race, so we're talking whether it's going to take place or not, and how the teams may be organized as well. Now, one thing that I have done proactively, and that's, I think, especially important at the bachelor level where we mostly teach in German, I started to communicate with all students on a first name basis, in the sense of reducing any barrier that we may have. And in German, that barrier is significant. Also for some international students, even in English, especially with an Asian background, getting closer is very difficult. Then first name basis turns into Professor Ralf, then Professor Spolenak, but it doesn't get as close as it might be. For the Swiss student, it works very well. Then the online equivalent of turning your back and asking the people to stand up is using clicker questions or using polls, which I do much more frequently than I did before. I think it's always important because it motivates the students that would be shy or didn't want to admit that they don't know something. But online, I think it's even more important than before. We talked about getting to know students, and last spring we had to change our exams, and I chose to do many of those exams as oral exams. That really helped me for the fall because many of those students I saw again in fall. And after being with me in an oral exams for 30 minutes, you really know a lot about the single students and their individual cases, much more than you actually learned from them through a whole semester of lecturing. With regards to teaching style, I'm using whiteboards much more than I used blackboards before. That also helps, even if I have PowerPoint slides prepared, even if I share PowerPoint slides with them, I've been starting to convert it into something written. That there's one point with regards to learning whether they understood or not. I mean, asking them is one option. I usually look into people's faces, and over the years, I can see whether they understood or not, and I can adapt my teaching accordingly. So that also means some classes that I've in the meantime, don't want to say it, but I've been teaching for 15 years. No year has been the same as the year before in terms of teaching style, also in terms of amount of content that was flexibly varied, increased or decreased depending on the student body. But I need the feedback from their faces. So interestingly, I had a harder time teaching in presence with the masks on rather than online afterwards, because at least I can see the faces there. And I haven't learned yet, and maybe that's a learning experience we all go through, to read from people's eyes whether they understood something or whether they didn't. And then some interesting effects for the very large classes. I could mute them when they enter, but I don't want to do that because then I really feel lonely. So I want to hear some background noise. And then obviously for the small classes, there's no problem. Everybody mutes themselves for the recordings, but for 300 people, there is always one or two people that unmute themselves, typically unintentionally. Sometimes that makes for some fun if they talk about something they didn't want to share, but it's not too personal either. But I have learned now really to, when I start to lecture, to mute everybody to avoid that. Good. And then maybe one point which I think is even more difficult online than it is in presence is that when you ask a question, to be able to resist the urge to say something in the silence or into the silence that develops. Because the students need time to think, the students need time to react. Many of them do not, or especially in the large courses, do not dare to raise their hands or to unmute themselves. So they are using the chats, and then the chats take some time for me to pop up and so on. So to resist that until the questions come in, that works very nicely. For the large classes, the chats are very valuable. And maybe some technical point, you can allow also the students to chat amongst themselves, and that would go towards the point of community building that Alessandro so nicely mentioned, that they don't only can talk to you, but also to the others. There's some caveats in chats. Sometimes they want to just communicate with you, and then you have to be careful not to read out that message to everybody, because that's what's not intended to be. And then one more observation, like in large classes at the end of the lesson, people come to you, and Malus has that experience of that. She was like lecturing after my my large lecture and really had to take the students out to free it for the next people. Well, you don't have to here. That's one point. The second point, if somebody comes up to you, you basically have a one-on-one conversation, maybe with one or two more people listening to it. But there may be many more people listening or interested in what you want like to say. So in the online mode, I had a Q&A at the end. People who wanted to stay could, the others left for the next lessons, but then there were 10 or 15 and could listen to that one-to-one or one-to-two conversations. So there is a chat. I found it helpful to have an assistant during Zoom lectures to take care of issues and so on. So yes, I agree. That would be helpful. I haven't tried myself. Maybe I should. Good. So basically, common denominator for all I've said. We need to entertain. We need to create an experience. But a lecture to be effective online always has to be more than a webinar. And that only works if you can engage students to do so. I've tried a couple of things, like I told you, not all of them have worked for every student buddy. I had one student buddy who was not interactive at all, and I was very unhappy that it didn't work out, and I tried what I wanted. At the end of the day, they were super happy with the lecture in terms of their feedbacks. I did not expect that. I've also seen the opposite, where the interaction was great, but the feedback was not so good. So I think it's also a learning process for everybody, and yeah, I'm happy to hear other suggestions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralf. That was really interesting. I love the fact that you said you have to be comfortable with silences. It's such an important point. I saw a number of people nodding as you were saying that. So it's clearly something that that many of you are aware of. I would love to poll you all to know how long you wait, because that is, of course, an important component, because sometimes being comfortable with silence means being comfortable for 3 seconds. And for other people, it means 8, 20, 60. So maybe we'll get into that later on. Thank you very much. I would like to now ask Tom to take the floor and to tell us about all the things that you've been doing that have helped you stand out to your students. Tom, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's quite clear that for good online teaching, you need shelves at a funny angle. That's the first rule. But I think that in the end, your question was, when you asked it a few weeks ago, I was really sort of perplexed by it, because it's an incredibly difficult question you're asking. What makes a good learning atmosphere? Goodness me. I mean, if we could put it in a bottle and sell it, we would be doing great. But I think that the other speakers have already identified most of the things, is that in the end, it's a human interaction. It's person to person, regardless of the number of people, regardless of the formality of the situation. And that is, in the end, the thing that we need to do is to kind of hit that rapport with another person. I think in architecture, it's maybe slightly different to the classrooms that have been described before, because the students are producing their own work, right? So they are the producers of the knowledge. So what you do is you set the tasks, you give some sort of background, and it's basically making them feel like they own the work, they own its successes, they own its failures. The failures are useful. To make sure that you set up a situation of respect. Really, that is fundamental to the very beginning, that you're eye to eye, that you remove any unnecessary hierarchy, as you've already been mentioned, first names, and the capacity for students to have agency at a kind of academic level, but also at a personal level. And you mentioned when you contacted me, that one of the events that had been mentioned was that students, I'm going to share a screen, let's see if this works. Students had let off some fireworks. So this is last September 20, at Hunkerberg. And this was a project. This is the beginning of a project at Hunterberg, a kind of collaborative project, in fact, that we're doing with Susanne's colleague, Tom Crowther, which is very exciting. It's kind of the making of a garden that students make. And it's about collaboration and about students learning to trust one another as well as us as teachers. This is them making the garden. Kind of practical exercises, but it's also a very beautiful piece of design. This is, you know, students at work, students doing things that they've never done before, but doing it in teams. Learning new skills together. We're not necessarily didactic. They have to go and find them for themselves. We set the thematic and the issue and the question. They have to find the solutions. And I think that those are the sorts of things which I feel like are key to building a kind of a community. I think Alessandro used that word. I would completely agree with that, that they believe it's their community for learning and that we're all in it together. The other things which I think are kind of basic background rules, or background principles. My mother's a teacher, and when I started teaching 20 years ago, she said, never overestimate their knowledge and never underestimate their intelligence. And I think it's kind of a fantastic principle because it means that you always interact absolutely straight. We all believe that the sum total of our knowledge is everything we have. And it doesn't matter whether you're a professor or whether a student. And I think you have to respect that knowledge, you have to respect that experience and bring it to it. And I think then also, I think it's a fundamental thing that Susanne mentioned is the passion. I mean, in the end, you know, it's why we're all here. And it's because we believe these issues, these processes, this education is important, is vital. It will, to us as people, to society, and that's a kind of key component. And then maybe, you know, finally, I would say that it's about creating safe spaces where people feel empowered to be as confident or as unconfident as they are in an honest way, and to be able to kind of move forwards with all of those uncertainties that we all have and all of those passions that we all have. And then maybe a little bit of humor doesn't go down badly, that's a very, very difficult subject to analyze. There is nothing less funny than explaining a joke. But humor can be incredibly useful at bridging space, bridging gaps between us, sorting out the discomfort of new situations or of, you know, of situations where the work isn't necessarily getting lift off the way we would expect it to. And it's a really good way of sort of resetting our basis. So to some extent, I think we're talking about, you know, it's about human relations and how we make the most of them, because they're very, very powerful learning instruments when they work well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. You've just brought in a really interesting sort of human element in what you've said. You've really described some very specific nuances that are incredibly important to building strong relationships with people. And I fully agree, the importance of the relationship when it comes to learning is something that anyone who has a child or a pet will recognize. Thank you very much for offering that into the group. There are some comments in the chat which are challenging the idea of being on a first name basis. Would you or Ralf just like to respond to that before we move on to our last speaker?
Tom, do you want to say something, or shall I?
Sure. I mean, as far as I mean, basically, I'm coming from, you know, an Anglo-Saxon context where we have the benefit of not having the Sie and Du, right? So we can move across formalities and informalities relatively easily, which I find quite helpful. I also come from, before I was at ETH, I was teaching in Cambridge, and I was a student in Cambridge. And the only time we would use the title professor to a professor would be to tease them, right? Titles are for formal events, correspondence, documents, and things like that. But in the day-to-day, I don't use it. I prefer it when students call me Tom, and for them. And basically, I prefer it for anybody to use whatever naming they feel most comfortable with. I feel more comfortable with Tom. It just means that we, in a sense, cut out quite a lot of distance between us as people. I mean, it was interesting that Susanne mentioned that, you know, having kids and doing homeschooling during the online process, the room I'm in here, I was teaching online, and in the room below me, my son came home from university and was learning online. We would meet at lunchtime, and I would go, oh God, so much Zoom. I'm so fed up with online teaching. And then he would go, God, Zoom, I'm so fed up with online learning. Right? And then we would exchange between, the student versus the teacher. And we would, it was quite challenging for both of us. It was extremely useful for me to get very direct feedback from somebody who was going through it on the other end. And then I knew that then at the, that we're, in a sense, we're all in it together. And I guess that's why I find first names a very liberating space to teach in.
Thank you for pointing out the importance of the cultural context there, because obviously that's a really important component that has an influence on people's comfort level with being on a first name basis. Ulrike, I'm going to be really cheeky and I'm going to ask you to hold your comment there, because it's really important to me that Milica gets a chance to make her contribution. So Milica, can I ask you to take the floor now for us? Sorry, Ulrike.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Karin and Julia. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I was really surprised by to hear about that feedback from the students. I also thought quite intensively how to respond. I mean, it was really a spontaneous development of a very specific format for a large classroom, as Ralf spoke about. I mean, I think in architecture, we are more used to teaching studios, which is a very direct engagement, which really entails almost a kind of a personal relationship and giving space to the student, encouraging them to, develop their own position. And however, in a large auditorium, my goal was not to never, of course, to create a kind of a frontal model and to ask students to reproduce knowledge. But on the other hand, it was really about developing a conversation, encouraging them to, to debate their position, debate the position of architect in a society in relation to, let's say, urban development, urbanization, the kind of contemporary topics of the built environment. And it was a surprise to me that that this class would have 200 students, right? So it was a kind of a very practical challenge to, to find a way to interact at very large numbers. And it began, in fact, as an effort to, to engage the entire auditorium. And we came up with a kind of a game that was very performative. So do something unexpected. When the students walk into the auditorium, we will ask them to produce a drawing and to pin it on a large wall. And that drawing would engage with a certain concept, let's say Anthropocene or urbanization or something that pertains to the theme of the class, which we will be debating. And this is something we've done in let's say, regular classrooms. So I think students like that very much. We would have this kind of a large wall with 200 drawings. We would spend some time in front of it, you know, have a chance to chat, to, you know, crack a joke, to see who is doing what and so on. And however, then all of this shifted to Zoom, and this was very disorienting because Zoom introduces obviously kind of additional level of distance, and we looked for a way to animate it, and the same exercise translated in the way that we asked the students, first of all, in the beginning of the class, turn on your cameras, you know, say good morning to each other, be, you know, let's be here together, you know, to have this moment of a kind of a embodied interaction. And then we put forward the concept of a day, you know, let's say ecophilia or biophilia, sorry, or something that, you know, so they have to really think, they sketch, they take a photograph with their phone and they post it to a WhatsApp group. And then within 5 or 10 minutes, we have a kind of a online exhibition. So the drawing starts scrolling on the screen, and, you know, each one is signed, and then we can call the speaker. Oh, wow, what a great, you know, what a great idea. Tell us about, you know, tell us about this, or, you know, so there is immediately conversation. So I think that was a very spontaneous, in a way, innovation, but it kind of colored the whole class because it was very, in a way, true to the effort. And I can mention that one other aspect was also to, you know, in the idea of engaging the students, of insisting on their commitment or the kind of reflection on their role, it was about kind of relativizing, let's say, authority of the professor, but, you know, also even of the kind of subject or the point of view that I'm conveying. So I also involved the guest speakers in the class, who would sometimes be, you know, coming from a different scientific field or having a distinctly different point of view, and also involving those guests in asking questions and also in being part of the evaluations, so on the actual kind of grading, influencing the grading, right? So let's say the entire, I think, setup became much more open and, you know, brought, I think, the kind of, created the kind of situation where you know, I hope I'm simply, let's say, one of the participants. So I'm quite glad that this worked out. And I think that what students appreciated, or actually I could, if we still have a minute, I could just show you perhaps some of those sketches or how that would look like. It will just take a minute. So that was one of the terms. So we asked them, okay, tell us about care, or what do you care about, or care as a concept, as a kind of everyday practice, but also as an institutional practice. What does it mean for you? And this is what we would have, let's say. And the essential component was that this would happen before the actual lecture, right? So that it already kind of gives a certain angle to the entire event that would take place. And I think that what I would also perhaps mention is that I found it rather surprising that this this model worked perhaps even better, you know, as a Zoom auditorium than as a live event, because I would not have expected that at all. I was very surprised, but I think that kind of insisting, you know, that we are, to say so, that we share a certain common space and have a conversation, and that there is a moment where, you know, everybody can contribute, and that this was realized in this kind of a large Zoom group, let's say. I think that was very successful. So also the fact that students, you know, they're not only that we disconnected, to say so, from our class, but students are also disconnected from each other. And I think they felt that loneliness very much. So to giving that chance to them also to have a certain conversation, I think that that is what helps them also, you know, go through the pandemic. So I am trying to stop sharing and finding my mouse. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I was immediately touched by the emotional character of those pictures. And I could see that also selecting a different word every time, you can be very deliberate as to what sort of environment or emotional environment do you want to create for the day. And of course, the students have the choice as to how open they want to be in their drawing, or how reserved they want to be in terms of their own emotional state. What an amazing way to create an emotional connection. Thank you very much for offering that to us. We have now heard from all of you, and I know that I have certainly got questions, but I want to first check in with Ulrich, who's been so kind and patient, and then we will see what the questions are from our community here. Ulrich, would you like to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to this first name basis, because I felt, to the contrary, when I taught in Canada before, so I was of course also used to this first name basis, but then I felt like the students were so uncomfortable that it created actually more distance. So exactly the opposite of what you wanted to achieve with that. So I found it also for the oral exam setup, I just found it much easier, as long as we do them in German, of course. If I admit to, yes, there is a gap, I'm definitely on the other level, but then it's clear, and then they don't feel like they are friends with me and I'm grading them at the same time. So I'm 100% for keeping it with Z if it's in German.
Ralf,
I believe you would like to.
Yes, sure. So first of all, I think there's no single truth in teaching. We're very diverse. Our student bodies are very diverse. Even if you teach the same lecture, every year will be a different experience. So I think every one of us has to find out what works for himself. So I think there are no real wrongs or rights. I had exactly the same experience as Ulrike did when I was teaching in presence. And I still have the rule, well, now I'm changing it. I had the rule, students would only call me on, and I them on the first name basis once they start a master thesis in my group. But I changed that on purpose in the online mode to make a statement. And I also asked them whether they would like to do that. And if there had been any rejection, I wouldn't have done it. And it takes some getting accustomed to, but for me and that specific buddy, that works. And I can completely see why it doesn't work all the time. So for me, this was a step specific to the online mode to say, okay, let's get rid of all those social barriers and try to communicate in a more direct fashion. And maybe one comment on the two levels, which we may rethink as teachers. We have a dual role. And this dual role is in conflict with each other. On the one hand, we train our students, we are mentors to our students, and then suddenly at the end of the semester, we change our role and become examinators or examiners. Maybe we should rethink that and say, okay, one set of lecturers does the teaching, is the closer, is the mentoring part, and then another set, decoupled, is then actually those people that do the tests and do the exams.
Thank you for that. Alessandro, you're just on mute. Yep.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff on the table. Maybe, you know, concerning the name, business. Okay, I'm one of the big advocates of the first name policy, although I obviously recognize the complexity of the matter, right? But let me say just a couple of quick things without trying to, solve the problem, which is extremely delicate and culturally rich. So I think it's important for us somehow to not confuse respect with formality, right? So they are sort of related things, but at the same time, you can keep them quite separate. And now concerning the exams, I think concerning mathematics, I try to make it clear that when we evaluate an exam, we are evaluating a performance. We're not evaluating a person. And how do we implement that in practice? Of course, I'm also chairing the committee for any exam of my courses, but the evaluation process involves, say, 5 people who may be junior to me in an academic sense, but nevertheless they are independent, right? So I don't think it's reasonable or feasible within a university to have these joint sets of people, one set, giving the course and another evaluating. But in a way, we can try, to be as close as possible during the course, but then make sure that somehow there's no personal factor involved in the evaluation process. Like the evaluation process should be, in my opinion, a very objective process with a bunch of people, with general schemes, no personal sympathy involved, right? And I think in the math department, at least, we are trying to implement that very carefully. For instance, we now don't use names anymore in the exams. So we now just use numerical codes. Of course, this only applies to written exams, that's obvious, right? But when it comes to written exams, there's no personal identifier allowed anymore. So that's the way we try to handle this process. And also, we try to handle any sort of bias that might be related to that.
So creating anonymity there. Yeah, thank you. Tom, you have your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to add, I think Ulrika raises a really important point. I would say that I would caveat my statement by saying, I can only ask how students address me. I cannot determine how I address them. So that's a really important point. If they feel uncomfortable with any form of address, then it is absolutely their space to determine what that is. So I can say, I feel more comfortable with my name. And I think also Alessandro's point that informality and respect are also, I think you can maintain very very important and kind of proper forms of respect in both directions within a certain level of informality. And I think that relates to Ralph's comment about examination. Our own evaluations actually happen in the form of public reviews, with guests, and so it's done in public as an exchange, which is also a whole pedagogical world in itself. It's a complicated space, so most of the evaluation is done in a discursive way as a kind of an exchange. Of course, in the end, there is a grade. It is interesting, it took me quite a long time to get used to it at ETH. I've been here now 10 years, that in Cambridge, you are not allowed to grade a student you have taught. It is a fundamental conflict of interest. And that's an interesting thing. And suddenly I arrived here and they said, oh no, you grade your own students. And I go, what? Like I'm invested. I've got skin in the game. I've been teaching it. So that's a sort of, again, then that becomes another space, which is maybe less to do with the learning environment, the learning atmosphere, but nevertheless complicated.
That would have taken some getting used to, I'm sure. Thank you, Tom. Susanne, you wanted to make a comment as well. This will have to be our last one, I'm afraid.
Right. So I think the issue of how to address it and whether say Sie or du has a lot of funny stories behind. So I remember my husband to go then said a du to my parents, which was absolutely a no-go because of the cultural differences between Southern Germany and Northern Germany. So we almost, had a catastrophe in our family. While when I came to my grandparents, great-grandparents saying, kann ich euch helfen? I meant you too. And she said, oh, you must not say Sie. And I said, well, I didn't say Sie, I said euch, because you're two people, and then not this euch that you have in Switzerland. So obviously there's a lot of misconception about cultural differences and how to address it. And I think what has to be clear is that that you have this respect distance, no matter what kind of name you have, between you and yourself and your student, because you have the different roles you have, and the respect you can give in either saying the first name or the last name, I think doesn't matter, as long as you have a consistency between the different people, which you can break up by saying singular differences to the people, for example, the master student or the first year, whatever, but making it clear why this is the case. So I think I would be happy. I also share the Z much more because I was raised like that. So I can never say somebody older and a guy say, oh, you, huh? Das geht nicht für mich. But you learn it by time. So
thank you so much. That's a funny story with you. You're lucky that your wedding still happened then, I suppose. But, you know, as I sort of reflect on what I've heard here today, I hear a very clear message of how important it is to reduce distance, but illustrated in Alessandro's slide in the beginning. And you've all talked about the importance of connecting to students by reducing distance, and that distance can be created by many things: hierarchy, culture, age, expertise, all sorts of things, and the importance of respecting the students so that they feel respected and feel that they can contribute. And of course, creating an engaging environment where all the students can participate, whether it's drawing a picture, answering a poll, or digging a garden. And so you've provided us with a bouquet of examples of how we can close that distance with our students, for which we are very grateful. So thank you so much for being here. We are already over time, but I feel like we're just getting started in a way. And so please join me in thanking our presenters for taking the time to be here and for their presentations and preparations. And we hope very much to see you all again at an upcoming Refresh Teaching in 2 weeks. Julia, do you want to tell us what the topic is for that?
Yeah, sure. In 2 weeks' time, we have like interactive and motivating lectures coming up, and you find like all the description on our website from next Tuesday on, and we will also like inform you by email, and hope to see many of you again in 2 weeks' time. And also thank you from my side. It was really inspiring discussions and inputs. Thank you so much, and have a good time, and see you soon.